Welcome to the latest of our Blue Deal debates, when we discuss our seas, our fishing industry, and the marine environment. I'm Chris Davies. I'm a former chair of the European Parliament's Fisheries Committee and a senior advisor with Pedersen Public Affairs in Brussels. Now today, we're going to take another look at eco-certification and whether we can be confident that by buying fish products that carry an eco label, we really are helping to promote sustainable fishing and protecting life in our seas. The leading eco label is the blue tick logo of the Marine Stewardship Council. And we've heard from them in a Blue Deal debate 2 months ago. The MSC was set up in 1996 in a bid to promote long-term sustainable fishing by giving the fishing industry a commercial incentive to adopt best practice and take a long-term view. These days, it certifies as sustainable about 14% of the fish caught globally, and it's said to license some 20,000 different fish products sold throughout the world. But our sponsor today is a different MSC. The letters stand for Make Stewardship Count, an alliance of over 90 environmental organisations and fisheries experts. Now, many of its members would describe themselves as friends of the other MSC because they want the Marine Stewardship Council to be the gold standard of sustainability and its possession to drive forward better fishing practices. But critics, they are, because they're concerned that the gold is tarnished and changes in practice are needed if it is to shine brightly. My guests today are dialing in from many parts of the world. Shannon Arnold, Marine Programme Senior Coordinator with the Ecology Action Centre, part of Sea Choice, which is Canada's sustainable seafood programme. Bubba Cook, the Worldwide Fund for Nature's Western and Central Pacific Tuna Programme Manager, joining us from New Zealand. Jakob Surber, the Seafood Sustainability Specialist for Migros, which is the largest retailer in Switzerland and claims only to sell sustainable fish. Indeed, it claims to be the most sustainable retailer in the world. Steve Trent, Chief Executive of the Environmental Justice Foundation. And with us also is Brad Spear, Policy Director, Global Policy Director with a Sustainable Fisheries Partnership based in the USA. And SFP, I think, Brad, employs a team of 65 people working with major seafood buyers in 20 countries to try and promote sustainable buying policies. I'm not incorrect, Brad. You're not actually part of the Make Stewardship Count coalition, I think. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you're watching this and if you have questions or comments to make, then please make use of the chat feature on the webinar, and I'll do my best to raise some of them in the last half hour of our discussion. Now, I expect that most of our panelists will want to say how they think the Marine Stewardship Council's standards could be improved. So let me explain that the MSC was invited to participate in this discussion, but said that time conflicts prevented anyone being available. However, Rupert Howes, the Chief Executive, has said that he does want to take part in a Blue Deal debate in weeks to come. So I hope we'll get the opportunity to explore this further, achieve balance, and take a positive step forward for everyone who has an interest in promoting seafood sustainability. I want to start by asking you about the wider picture, because when I read the UN's Food and Agriculture Office's reports on the state of our seas, I get a mixed impression. On the one hand, we're clearly fishing very extensively and to some extent overfishing, and yet it's not all negative. There do seem to be signs of better management in a number of fisheries. So is the position optimistic or pessimistic? Who should we start with? Shannon, please.
Okay. I mean, I wouldn't be continuing to work in my field if I didn't have some optimism that things are, slowly shifting. And I work towards improving regulations and seeing those things move. But I think that we are all coming to a point to see that, we're potentially not moving quickly enough to catch up with the decades-long delays that we've had in terms of getting fisheries management up to speed. And we need to be tackling it a little bit quicker, even in Canada, which is considered a high-performing country. Only 30% of our fish stocks are considered healthy. 40% are in the critical zone or in the cautious zone. And the rest of the remaining 30%, we don't know the status. And, that is in a country that has the resources to be doing that. And so those are just the commercially fished species that we're landing, not, disregarding the other species that are not considered commercially valuable. So I think there's still a lot to do. But we are seeing, I think, a lot more discussion and understanding that overfishing is, like, for me, the biggest issue in our oceans management.
And Bubba, in New Zealand, or looking at the Pacific generally, are fishing practices improving or still deteriorating? Are we overfishing or getting things under control?
Well, I think I hope everyone can hear me. I think if you look at history, we have more fishing power than ever before. We're able to catch fish faster and more effectively than ever in history.
You're doing fine. We can hear you perfectly.
I'm sorry, the video seemed to be playing for some reason on my end. So we're in a situation where we've got more fishing power out on the ocean, catching more fish than ever in history, and it's reflected in the fact that we have, virtually extirpated some species of sharks that have existed on this planet for 400 million years, sea turtles that have existed for 250 million years, and a number of seabird species who've existed on this planet for over 100 million years in a matter of just 100 years. And that should be a wake-up call for us all. I apologize. There's something happening on my end where the video seems to be running out.
If you need to, just try shutting. Much though we like looking at you, just shut off the video because your sound quality is fine. Okay. Let me turn to Steve though. Steve, Environmental Justice Foundation, optimistic or pessimistic? And given some of the reports I've read from EJF, it must be pessimistic because some of them are appalling. Not least about the extent of illegal fishing that takes place globally.
Well, there's several answers I could give to this without being a politician. The first is I'm a professional optimist. I think you have to be to work in this sector. But I would say, let's look at the figures of the fisheries that have been assessed. And that's a crucial distinction. You can say, give or take, 90% of them are either fished at optimal levels or beyond optimal levels. So they're either, just about sustainable or they are in fact unsustainable. As Bubba mentioned, we have increasing fishing capacity on global oceans. You have something in the region of $35 billion spent every year on fishing subsidies, of which at least 60% could be considered harmful, i.e. linked to illegal, unsustainable fishing. And you have a growing global population with an increasing demand for protein coming from seafood. And then on top of that, we have global heating. And I think anybody who is ignoring the impacts of our warming world on our ocean and our seas and the composition of the biodiversity within is either blind or a fool. So we have to put these things together into a common interconnected analysis, not to ghettoize them or to put them in individual pockets. Look at it together and come up with a strategic, interconnected and thoughtful program of interventions that can ensure marine sustainability, ecological security, the well-being of the fishers who depend upon them, the well-being of the consumers that need it for seafood protein. And that is not happening. So on that level, I am deeply worried. I wouldn't say pessimistic, but deeply worried. Last thing I'd say is that, and forgive me for indulging in a bit of a cliche, it doesn't have to be this way. And with this debate in hand, the MSC could play a fundamentally important part in turning this around.
Okay, Steve, you provide a bridge here, because clearly it would be enormously helpful if the governments of the world would wake up to the realities and put in place better governance of fisheries, which address some of the issues. But in the lack of that, then we look to certification of sustainable foodstuffs as one of the means of driving forward progress. So let me turn to you, Brad. You work with retailers. Certification, I mean, are retailers, are consumers interested in sufficient numbers to make a difference, to shape policy?
I would say not in sufficient numbers yet. Certainly in some markets where the eco labels have been prevalent for many years, since the MSC started, for example, in Northern Europe, in the UK, starting in North America a little bit after that. Consumers are becoming more aware and more demanding of it. But that's just a slice of the consumption in the world and a slice of the demand. And there are some key markets that are missing from that picture, particularly Japan. But Japan is emerging. There are other countries that are emerging in Southern Europe. But the biggest ones that are missing are China and South Korea, I think, in terms of consumption.
China's the biggest fishing fleet in the world, I think, isn't it? So lot to do to get them on board, so to speak. Let me turn to Jakob there, because the film, Netflix's film Seaspiracy, came out a year or so ago. And I think you were telling me that as a result of that film, your company got the number of inquiries about your company's sustainability policies increased, and there was growing pressure put on it to ensure that its practices were as good as they possibly could be.
Yes, that is true. Just about in the month or 1.5 months after the film came out, we had more inquiries about seafood, and especially concerning the MSC than we normally get within 2 or 3 years. So it just was within this 1 month, there was a massive amount of inquiries. It has dropped down a little bit. Oh, no, it has dropped down considerably again, but I would say that people are more aware than they used to be, because Switzerland is a landlocked country. Seafood is not on top of most people's priority list, but this film that came out, and you can say positive and negative things about this film, has certainly shaken a lot of consumers up. Yes,
but that film, you could say, it targeted Marine Stewardship Council or portrayed them in an unfair light, because if you look at the various bodies that certified fish, I mean, Shannon, for example, I mean, in Canada, you've looked at the various labels you can find on fish products, and I think you've got a report. Sea Choice came out with a report saying most claims in the Canadian market, most claims about sustainability or good fishing practice in the Canadian market are not subject to any independent oversight or standard. Well, the MSC is in a different category from that, is it not?
It is, yep. We have done extensive analysis, and we've worked on labeling, regulatory labeling on food packages, and eco-labeling and certification for a long time. And so, that's the quandary we kind of find ourselves in, is that we do talk to retailers and supply chain and say you should preferentially still serve MSC and ASC certifications. You can verify what's behind that certification, as opposed to picking up. That report was looking at, there's all sorts of claims when you start looking at seafood, like responsibly sourced, wild, like all these things, right? And there's very little regulatory processes around what you can put on labels. So yeah, it is kind of the best out there. And we've wanted to support it, and we've supported it for a long time. However, we're getting to a point over the last number of years where, it is one tool, the market. And using market tools is one way to move things forward. And we need that tool to be working in concert with the other work we're doing to get regulatory rules in place, to get management rules in place. And what has been more and more concerning for us over the last, say, 8 years with working with it is that potentially undermining the regulatory forward movement. And when you can get a rule in place by a government or a fisheries management body, that's a big umbrella thing that's going to move a whole bunch of fisheries forward. So when we see a kind of a market tool, which is one part of our toolbox that we have, undermining that forward momentum in the regulatory sense, that's where we have been getting a bit worried about the role that those certifications might be playing. Even though when you just look at the certifications and labeling by themselves, they rise above for sure in terms of the robustness of the standard, how verifiable it is, and all of that.
Okay, I'll give you a warning, Steve, that we can hear you typing when you're typing. So, turn your mic off. Brad, just on this issue of certification, I mean, how much difference does it make? I mean, how much difference for the better can the certification of sustainability of seafood make? How can it shape? Does it make a difference in shaping fishing practices?
It certainly does. It does drive the demand for improvements, and based on the standard itself, it has ladders or benchmarks of improvement that are required for fisheries to move up on over a course of time. I guess I don't have the same view as Shannon in terms of the eco-label prohibiting or getting in the way of some policy improvements. I think there's just some challenges with some of the fisheries that are trying to achieve certification that are operating in waters of governments that simply don't have the resources to support the fishery as it should in terms of high quality governance and in terms of research and data analysis and the funds to make that happen. So it's a challenging limitation in my mind of the MSC at the moment to have that dependency upon governments to be able to deliver on aspects of fisheries management that a single fishery or a certified unit can't do itself.
Okay, thank you. But Jakob, coming to you as someone who actually, you have to satisfy your consumers that your company genuinely is meeting its target of buying only sustainable fish, and so you presumably want a clear label that you can absolutely have confidence in and trust. But I think you've told me that there's some real rogues out there.
Yes, that is very much an issue. So the point is, I would say for seafood, a labeling is even more important than in other fields because, for example, we sell also meat, beef. But by the time you have a cow at a slaughterhouse, it has a chip in its ear, and from that chip, we know from the cow where it was born, all the places it's lived, basically its life until it comes to the slaughterhouse. And then, for food, that's fairly limited. We have beef, we have pork, we have chicken. Then for seafood, on the other hand, we sell 70 different species seafood in Migros. So they are from all over the world, not mainly from Switzerland. So there's huge value chains and sometimes very intransparent value chains, which is obviously a problem if you want to sell sustainable seafood. So I would say that a labeling is in seafood even more important than in certain other fields. However, then the question is, well, how far does this labeling go? So if I get a consumer inquiry, which is, well, can you guarantee that there's no dolphin in your seafood? And it's like, sorry, can't really guarantee that. Well, how about your labeled food? It's like, yeah, sorry, can't guarantee that either. Well, if you look deep enough into it, like saying absolutely zero dolphins being caught is not realistic. But try teaching to a consumer is like, yeah, the labels, they're kind of better, but do they all the things you want? It's like, nah, not really. So that makes it very difficult saying like, oh, yes, we have a label here. It provides us with all our needs because, well, at the moment, it unfortunately does not.
Okay, I hear you. We're going to have a look now at the work of the Marine Stewardship Council and criticisms of it or suggestions for improvement. But before we do that, can I just establish and build on those remarks? do any of you disagree with the statement that of all the certification bodies, of all the bodies that provide eco labels, the MSC is the nearest to approaching the gold standard? It is, though it has no equivalent rival. Is that a fair statement? Okay, so I'm assuming we're setting up the MSC because, and we're targeting the MSC because it's the best and we want it to be better. Fair? So let's cut to the chase and go to the criticisms. And the criticism I've heard most often is that the MSC has done very good work in the past and has driven forward progress, but is now certifying or allowing fisheries to be certified that really don't meet the gold standard of sustainability that should be the target. Fair enough, Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how we would characterize it. And again, we kind of undertook a pretty in-depth study looking at a decade of MSC certifications and trying to get down to what had actually changed on the water, which is a little bit difficult to do. But given, these conditions that they get, a requirement of certification to continue to improve once they're in certification, and looking at what they had done to try and tease out, are there actual changes happening on the water to fishing practices through the certification? And, some of our biggest findings out of that, like broad look at a decade of MSC certifications, was that the vast majority, and this is MSC's own consulting has also found this, that a big amount of improvements happen while people are trying to get to the assessment. So pre the certification. So that's really great. And then once they get into the certification, this starts to slow down. And concerningly, what MSC often argues back is that, they're not 100% when they come in. It's hard for consumers to understand that, but there's kind of 3 scoring levels inside the certification. And if you're halfway in, you get these conditions that you have to improve upon, and you're supposed to do that. You have 5 years. If you weren't 100% for your certification, basically you have 5 years to fulfill these conditions that you're given. And one of our most concerning things that we found was that 80% of the fisheries we looked at didn't fulfill their conditions around the bycatch species, impact on habitats, the kind of this threaten to the ecosystem, the impacts on the ecosystem conditions. They were just given an extension after that, and many of them took 7 to 9 years to actually end up becoming like the full certified best practice. In the meantime, everybody's buying that labeled fish thinking it's globally best practice. And so that, is really concerning. And that seems to be happening more and more and more. And we would argue that those fisheries are being given the certification prematurely, perhaps, that they should be, really getting up to that before you get that stamp of approval advertising that you're the global best practice, when in fact, with a lot of these conditions. And, we're seeing, I think people would be surprised at the type of fisheries that you're able to buy, the type of seafood that you're able to buy. We have a hydraulic clam dredge fishery that, sucks up the bottom of the seafloor and sucks up Arctic surf clams that are 50, 60 years old. It liquefies the sea bottom. That's certified as sustainable. One of our fisheries that we have worked on for many, many, many years, and it was the first pelagic longline fishery. Try not to use too much fisheries jargon here, but this fishery for swordfish and tuna, which has, a 50-kilometer line, thousands of hooks on it that are looking for swordfish and tuna. Meanwhile, they catch, 40, 50 different types of species, in particular interactions with sharks and sea turtles and that kind of thing. The Canadian one was the first ever to be certified under the Marine Stewardship Council. We fought it for a long time, and we wanted that certificate to try and help that fishery be improved. Since then, many pelagic longline fisheries have been certified, and
can I just turn
it hasn't changed anything on the water.
Okay.
They're still catching hundreds of sharks with no limits. They're still catching sea turtles, no limits. That Surber
this is a big issue. It may well be that I think one of the criticisms is that MSC may be certifying as sustainable the commercial catch which is being sold, that it's not being overfished. But in the process of catching that fish, the echo, there can be serious harm done to the rest of the ecosystem, not least through bycatch. Bubba, I know you're coming and going electronically, but are you able to I think you've expressed concerns about the state of the tuna fisheries in the Pacific and the bycatch that's caught along with them. Are you with us?
Yeah, Chris. I'm going to avoid turning my video on because I'm having issues on my end. I think one of the challenges, and I'm not sure if it's been mentioned before, is that it's not just a directed catch that's the problem. It's all the other species that are captured as bycatch, and that's certainly one of the overriding issues in the Pacific, where we have two of the most endangered shark species, including oceanic white-tip shark and silky sharks. These fisheries have an impact on more than just the target species. And if we can't figure out a way to ensure that those species are protected, then the fisheries aren't truly sustainable. So,
let me ask you practical questions. No one wants to get this bycatch. I mean, they're out to catch tuna. So how come the sharks get caught? And are there practical steps that could be taken to prevent them being caught?
Well, in fact, there are, and some of those measures do get implemented by some countries, but not all countries. And in the case of oceanic white-tip and silky sharks, there are countries that use, don't use wire leads or the wire trace that allows them to catch sharks more effectively and prevents those sharks from biting off and potentially surviving. But it's not.
That's something a shark could do, but a tuna couldn't do. Is that how it works? So,
correct. So sharks tend to have big sharp teeth that the tuna don't have, and even in cases where fishermen have claimed that large big-eye tuna can break off a mono lead, and that was justification for using the wire leads, they've since turned the corner on that and agreed that they can use monofilament leads as opposed to wire leads. So it's an issue of some sectors of the industry that refuse to either take on the appropriate measures for one reason or another. In many cases, it's just simple recalcitrance to change. But yes, there are things that we could do to prevent, bycatch of these species by the way that we set the gear and retrieve the gear and the type of gear that we use. But the reality is that, these are somewhat non-selective gears. They're designed to catch fish. And when they're set, they catch all different kinds of fish. So there's always going to be an impact. The goal should at least be to minimize that impact on the non-target species.
And the tuna stocks, the commercial stocks, if you like, are they being fished sustainably? I mean, we're not overfishing those stocks. It's the bycatch that's the problem.
If you look at the stock assessments for all the major tropical tuna stock species, as well as the temperate stocks of South Pacific albacore in the Pacific, they're all in the green zone of the Kobe plot, or the tool that we use to measure whether they're being sustainably harvested. Many of them are also pushed to the limit, so to speak, in that they're sitting on the edge of commercial or potentially biological viability, which means that we fish them as hard as we can to skim as much interest off the principal of the account as possible. That's just been the design of fisheries, is to maximize the sustainable yield. Which we've in recent years we've come around to the idea of optimizing the yield, or at least putting an ecosystem-based management that recognizes the broader impact of a target fishery on other species and on the species that you're targeting itself. But on the whole, the science suggests that we are fishing sustainably in the sense that we are not mining into the principal at this point, but we are close on a couple of species.
Okay. Steve, you would say, presumably, that, listen to that the problem is if you like, the definition of sustainability is not being applied properly. It's you can't really say if you're concerned about the marine environment, you can't say that a fish stock is sustainable if the bycatch, if threatened species are being caught up along with the commercial species.
Well, exactly. And I think you could look in some of the fisheries that have been certified, you could look at the target species. So we've mentioned tuna, but if you look at the Atlantic bluefin tuna fishery, we do not believe that is sustainable. And that is the target species. And then you layer on top of that the bycatch, which in all too many instances is highly damaging, and you could put it into that basket of sustainability. Perhaps the key point I would make here in all of this, because my interest is actually keeping this very simple and focused, is why will the MSC not listen to the huge body of expertise, the multiple experts that reside in different organisations like Shannon, with Brad, with WWF, with Pew, with others? Why will they not listen to those interventions and understand that we have legitimate concerns that can and should be addressed? And why are they pursuing a growth policy that undermines the end game of the label? Because I tell you one thing, if you talk to consumers, what they want is a simple message that's got integrity, if you like, that tells the truth. If you confuse that message, you will turn consumers everywhere, and ultimately you will undermine your own business model. So I think they have a real fundamental problem here, both in the conservation piece, but also in their own self-interest, in their business model. The pathway they're following is not sustainable for them or for the marine fisheries that they're certifying all too often.
Thanks, Steve. Someone, by the way, is typing, and it's we can hear every tap of the keyboard. So if you could mute if you're doing that. Jakob, I take it you'd agree with Steve. You're looking at that label. Your customers are looking at that label. They want guarantees that label means something.
Well, yes, I would say so, because what I consider especially problematic is that, like, as soon as it's got the blue tick on it, people, or I would say some people, consider it sustainable. And there are some fisheries which we source from, which are MSC certified, which I wouldn't personally consider sustainable at all. But because it has the blue tick, it is considered sustainable, and we can sell it.
Got an example, Jakob?
Well, my favorite example is always what gets dredged or trawled out of the North Sea. So we have a massive amount of bottom trawling in the North Sea, including in marine protected areas. And I think it's horrible that a certified sustainable product can be trawled from the bottom of a marine protected area. I mean, something is just not right at this point.
Yeah, I have sympathy with that, but at the moment around Europe, something like 96-98% of MPAs are not being properly protected from all activity. Interesting.
Well, yes, but then, but at this point, I would say, well, yes, that is a huge problem. But if not even buying certified fish addresses this problem, well, then, what good is the certification for? So okay. I think saying is like, hey, we do not bottom troll. We do not use huge plows in a protected area. That doesn't sound like an enormous commitment you have to make.
Brad, you must be sorry. Well, let me go to Brad first, and then use Shannon. Brad, you're working with retailers. I mean, they're asking the same questions as Jakob, or are they just saying, look, we have a few people who write to us and they're concerned, but actually the majority of people buy on the basis of price.
That often is an overriding factor. Unfortunately, I mean, these are major businesses, stakeholders, and other commitments that they need to balance. But I would say we are hearing more from retailers about these specific issues that are being raised. They're getting more educated because they have been on this journey for the 15 and 20 years, along with the eco label and other work by organizations represented by ourselves. So they are getting more educated, and they are starting to ask pointed questions about specific fisheries that they're sourcing from, including MSC certified fisheries. And I think one of those fisheries that has come up recently is the Gulf of Maine lobster fishery and its interactions with the protected and threatened right whale and its interactions with the gear that is used in that fishery. And rightfully so. I think it's one of the major challenges that the MSC is facing right now in terms of a fishery that could potentially be recertified with that sort of interaction. I think they're in the middle of that process to make that determination, or the certification assessment body is. So we'll have to wait and see where that shakes out. But I will
please
just real quick on the protected bycatch. It is an area that the MSC is focusing on for their standard review currently. And we take the view that they are proposing some positive changes in that direction. I think the biggest challenge in our mind is adapting with the best practices as they evolve. Bubba flagged a bunch of those, and the way you fish, the type of gear that you use, and just how much observer coverage should be on vessels is something that changes rapidly with science and with what our understanding. And the standard currently doesn't have that sort of flexibility or that adaptability, and we think that should be built in.
Thanks, Brad. I should point out that the Marine Stewardship Council is carrying out the standards review at the moment. I think it's an interim report will come out in the new year. So of course people want to make the points and trying to influence the future of MSC policy now. MSC, I suspect, would come back. I mean, some of you said MSC doesn't listen, but of course the point that Brad just mentioned about right whales getting tangled in the ropes of the American lobster pot fishery. MSC tell me they've withdrawn the certification as a result of that, and they would point to other examples where certification has been either withdrawn or not given, despite the fact that there is some evidence, for example, of I think the orange ruffy in Australian deep sea waters. You'll know this better than myself, Bubba. Areas where they could have given certification but haven't because they've taken, if you like, a precautionary approach. Bubba, do you want to come in through there?
Yeah,
the MSC would argue, but sometimes scientists take different views, and we follow peer-reviewed science just as you do, but scientists don't always agree.
And that's a fair criticism, and the point of the scientific process is to bring all of those scientific views to the table and then make an assessment on those views based on peer review. And if that's the way that it's being approached, then that's the way that it should be approached. That's science in practice. At the end of the day, and I'm sorry I haven't heard all of the discussion, but at the end of the day, any assessment of sustainability is about accountability, and that accountability is only achieved through proper monitoring of the fisheries, and that includes, as Brad pointed out, observer coverage. And when you look at observer coverage around the globe, it's abysmal in many fisheries. In the Western Central Pacific tuna fisheries, for instance, we have less than 5%. 5% is not even statistically significant to provide a good detail of information to apply to stock assessment. And because of that, we're continually applying assessments that may not be based in reality because we're not getting the information that we need from those fisheries, the reliable information, in order to be able to make those good assessments. And so getting that visibility into the fisheries, that transparency of the fisheries in a way that they can be held accountable for the impact that they're having at sea, that's a critical feature that I don't think we're really achieving across many of the fisheries that are prosecuted around the globe today. Yeah,
I mean, I think we all know, because it's been revealed by EJF and others, that being an observer on some of these boats is not the most. It doesn't increase your life expectancy. I mean, it's a difficult job to do, and I wonder, what holds back people from increasing the observer numbers. Is that because the fishing companies won't pay to have observers, or was it because you can't get the observers in the first place? Shannon, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I would argue.
Sorry,
I'm
Bubba.
sorry. Go ahead. I couldn't quite hear who he was asking there.
Oh, I was going to say I'd say it's both, but I'm sure other people can speak to that. It's certainly both, but I would note that many of the certified fisheries that we have worked with that are, the scientific advice, for example, for pelagic longline fishery that's done by the official science council of the management bodies is saying 20% is what you should be aiming for sufficient coverage. We've been working on that for years, and we have heard years and years at the table. We're MSC certified. We are considered a sustainable fishery, and we have 5% observer coverage, and that was good enough to get us MSC certified. Why do we need 20%? Right? Because they are meeting the legal requirement that got passed that takes forever. Regulations take a long time to pass. And so that use of the certification to kind of argue against further improvements that are advised by science, because there's one thing about what's advised by science, and then there's one thing about, the political negotiations and what the decision makers end up doing, and the balance that governments and regulatory bodies are taking. And so what is interesting, I think, a couple of points back, is that this idea that MSC is like certifying global best practice isn't quite, they actually describe themselves as being just behind the crest of the wave. So the wave is over here, they say, and that is where they're waiting for like 60% of governments and regulatory bodies to take up regulation. And then they're going to come just behind that crest of the wave and make sure fisheries are doing it. And I don't think that was what we all thought they were doing at the beginning. I think they've transitioned a little bit. And so that's just really compliance. Those are fisheries that are that's legally what you're supposed to do. Do we need a certification that's very expensive for fisheries to achieve, and for small fisheries, in fact, to achieve, to be able to just comply? I think people are expecting that certified fisheries are actually proactively taking those steps further than like a very slow government body or very slow regulatory body. And I think that's, you mentioned they have 20,000 products, and in the marketplace, there's this constant demand for more products, new products, more labeled products, right? That kind of thing. But what's interesting is that in all of this discussion about bycatch and improvements that can be made, and you can only improve gear so much, there is always more than one way to fish a fish. And I think people forget that. So, if you're going to fish tuna, if you're going to fish swordfish, you can do it with a single hook and line. You can do it with a harpoon. We have a very robust, hundreds of people have harpoon licenses here in Canada. Or you can do it with pelagic longline, which is a very unselective type of fish. If you want cod or pollock, you can do it with bottom hook and lines, or you can do it with trawling. And what we've seen is at the beginning of the certification programs, those much less impact gears were certified. They were getting certified, and they were finding premium prices, and they were getting market access. And it was working like it was supposed to be working for those fisheries, which are harder to prosecute. It's more expensive to do it. It takes longer out on the water, right? And then all of a sudden, once all of those ones were certified, then comes along the certification for the pelagic longline, for the trawl, for the other way of catching that same fish. And that differentiation in terms of gear was gone. And those like low impact gears that are more expensive to do already were started to lose out their market price, because their rival gear, which is much more efficient at taking, you can scoop everything up, choose the things you want, right? I'm simplifying fisheries here, but and so that's a real problem. What we would love to see with the certification is support for those fisheries that are more expensive to prosecute, right? That are more expensive to do. And that's where the demand in the marketplace, if we could get more of that demand, switching gears should be an option, right? Instead of trying to like fix gears that are ultimately less and less selective, right? So I think we forget about the simpler, easier way in some of these fisheries.
Okay,
maybe that's also something I can hook in here real quick, is that one of the things that I think the MSC actually does reasonably well is the chain of custody. However, what I find kind of problematic is that there is no guarantee on the fishing gear. So I do know from the last
Stop there, Jakob. I'm going to come on to that point, and I will come to you. Let's just wrap this bit up. I mean, the concern is, and we feed this in, if you like, to the standards review being carried out by the MSC. Is the precautionary principle, if you like, should be taken more into account. That they should be different scientists may have different views, but please, you know, what did Shannon say? Don't be behind the wave, be at the front of the wave when it comes to sustainability.
Or at least on top of it.
Yeah. You think they're good, be better. Right. Now, let us just move on. But before I do, let me just, to those watching, say that you are watching a Blue Deal debate with myself, Chris Davies. And with us, you have, you can see Shannon Arnold from Sea Voice in Canada, Bubba Cook from the WWF, based in New Zealand, Jakob Surber, sustainability specialist for Migro, Steve Trent of the Environmental Justice Foundation, and Brad Spear, the director of Sustainable Fisheries Partnership in the USA. Right, now let's look at a point that Jakob was raising there, which is about the whole issue of data and decision making and the transparency of it by the MSC. And Jakob, talking before we started, you said to me, as someone who's responsible for buying sustainable fish, I want to know who catches the fish, where they're catching it, and what method they're using. That's the basic requirements, is it not?
Well, that is the legal requirement.
That's the legal requirement.
Wait. Okay, sorry. Sorry. Wrong way around. So I have to. In Switzerland, you're legally required to have on your product what species is it, where is it caught, so the FAO zone or the country in terms of aquaculture, and the fishing gear category. And if you want to be more specific, obviously you want the ZUB zone because FAO 27 is pretty big. And you want to have the specific fishing method because, a mid-water trawl that goes through the water is obviously a lot less harmful than one that gets dragged along the bottom of the ocean.
Okay, thank you. Can I just say there is some background noise, so could you look at your microphones, please, and not necessarily our immediate participants. There may be someone else in the wings with an open microphone. Okay, so this issue of transparency. How, Steve? You've often voiced criticisms. How transparent is the MSC? Because they would say, of course, that they publish an enormous amount of data on their website. I've never looked at it. Too much and too complicated, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, you can publish all the data you want. If it's selective and designed to deceive, then it doesn't actually tell you what you need to know. And I think there's an element of that going on here. I mean, I want to say again, we're a friend of the MSC, we want them to succeed and all of those kind of nice platitudes. But the reality here is, why not make your systems open to scrutiny? Why not invite independent expert analysis of your certification schemes and what's really going on? And all too often, in my experience, what happens in these kind of issues is that the debate is taken out of the real world. It's taken off the boat where it really happens and out of the water, and it's plonked in some discussion forum or some anodyne boardroom somewhere where people like me in a bad suit can sit there and discuss the rights and wrongs of it. We know what is going on. And this is the issue. We know how bad these problems are. You don't have to be a postdoctorate in fisheries management to understand that. We can see it. It's been well documented. So now I think the time is to look at the solutions. And what I would say to the MSC is open yourselves up to scrutiny. If you're afraid of being transparent, it probably suggests you've got something to hide. And listen to a broader network of expert advice to make your systems better. Last thing I would say is, for anyone who questions why I'm raising these points, somebody earlier, I think, mentioned orange roughy, for example. Now, an orange roughy, that fish that gets caught is probably old enough to be your grandmother, Chris, or more. Okay, they're late to mature, slow to breed. They're pretty vulnerable in their ecological status. The orange roughy fishery that was mentioned would have been certified if it were not for the vigorous objections of Australian conservationists, of WWF and others. And that was being led by the MSC. And you have to ask yourself, why were you prosecuting that campaign? It was pointless, again, and self-defeating and wrong. So I think we have to look at this as we're trying to get back to the transparency issue, through a lens of transparency, make the systems transparency, allow everybody to look in. This is what we should be doing across the architecture of global fisheries management. We could be putting in very cost-efficient, logistically deliverable, technologically available systems right now that would make the entire systems, the entire supply chains, far more transparent. And whether you are a fisheries management official, whether you're an enforcement agent, whether you're a consumer, whether you are a certifier, whether you are a retailer, you could have a better understanding of the who, what, where, when, and how. And that's what we need to see happen. And I think what the MSC is being very good at in all of this is hiding behind a barrage of partial data, partial answers, comments about we'd love to join your debate, but we're too busy. Comments to say, yes, we're looking at this now, we'll come back to you in 6 months, a year. And my message to them, to the chief executive, to Rupert Howe, was, okay, enough is enough now, Rupert. You've got to get serious about this, because you are generating substantial doubt, concern, and I would go as far to say opposition to that blue tick.
Bubba, out the other side of the world, from many of us, just looking at you're part of WWF, and WWF, of course, was one of the founding partners of the Marine Stewardship Council. Do you have a sense that somehow the way in which they reach decisions is not as open and transparent as you would wish?
Well, certainly as someone who's participated in surveillance audits and certifications and recertifications and dealt with a number of the conformity assessment bodies that engage in the process, I can say that there's a lot of aspects of it that are non-transparent as far as some of the decisions that are ultimately made based on that information. But I think you hit on a key point here, and since we're talking about the future of certifications and where things are headed, I think the point of transparency and particularly traceability is a really important one, because I think it's an inevitability that we're going to move towards more transparent and more traceable seafood products that are going to put even more scrutiny on the MSC chain of custody and how fish ultimately reaches the plates of consumers in such a way that it's going to make, with any luck, it'll make organizations like the MSC or any other certification much less relevant. Because when consumers and markets are able to see definitively where their food comes from and how it's produced, and be able to tie it to a particular producer and practices that they engage in, then it's going to create a lot more transparency over the entire seafood supply chain in such a way that the MSC is going to have to own up to its challenges and any fallibilities in the system that it has in place. And like I said, that's an inevitability. It's coming. We will have technology in place that will allow us to see exactly where our seafood comes from and what down to the vessel eventually. And it's not that far away.
Brad, if the MSC was to respond to some of the debate we've had so far, they would say, look, whenever we try to certify a product, difficulties get flagged up, and we try to address those difficulties. We try to promote better practice. But it's also much easier for fisheries to make claims when they're not producing data and they're not as transparent. And we are more transparent than all the others. I mean, in your work with retailers and with the fishing industry, I mean, all of these things require extra cost and therefore resistance to certification, does it not? I mean,
yeah, that's right. But I think with the responsibility of the leading eco label in the world, you have to be up to the challenge. And I think one of the issues that our retailers face is with certified fisheries that do have these conditions that need to be met on a certain time scale. Those conditions and how well the fisheries are progressing is very difficult to monitor. They're buried in highly technical PDF documents on the MSC website, and I think there could be more transparency around the progress of these fisheries And the reason the retailers are interested is because they have commitments to source MSC certified product. And if there are fisheries that are going to be suspended or having challenges in meeting their conditions, they need to know about it. And they need to be able to adapt their sourcing, or better, they need to know what the issue is specifically so they can use their leverage to intervene. They can call their suppliers to get them to intervene. They can call the governments directly in the countries where the fish is coming from to ask for improvements because of the risk of losing the certification. So I think that sort of cycle could be facilitated with a little more transparency.
Okay, thank you.
I think that on the transparency and especially traceability issue, before I said, and actually there were two people asking in the comments, so there are the legal requirements what we need to put on there, but obviously this is not enough to know about the sustainability of a value chain. And I think here the MSC, as the most known seafood label, could do a lot more, because the kind of twisted around thing is that if we as Migros want to sell a product with an MSC label on it, we as retailer are supposed to tell the MSC which fishery this is coming from. And it's like, I do really ask myself, it's like, well, obviously Migros is paying the MSC as a certifying body, so we can put this label on there, but then we as a retailer are supposed to find all the way back through whoever processed this fish, find the fishery and tell that to the MSC. So, I mean, there is definitely a traceability and a transparency issue, but if a label cannot provide this, well, who else is supposed to provide this? And Bubba, you said before that, and well, also you, Steve, that we do have the technological means right now, so we can trace these fisheries back. There are already some companies that are doing it, that you can trace all the way back to the fishery. And yes, I would very much agree. So that at the point where we do have this traceability in place, where I can really say, it's like, hey, this swordfish has been caught pole and line. If I'm buying MSC, I'm not running the risk of buying long line. Well, then yes, I do think that the label is going to lose more and more of its importance.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Just on this wider issue of transparency, not necessarily the data, you wrote to me and said that the transparency of the standard review process carried out by the Marine Stewardship Council has been a major issue in the past. And even if we disagree about various aspects, if the rationale and process is clear, then it's easier for us. If it's the process and lack of understanding of how conclusions were arrived at that really frustrates those involved in it all. So, I mean, why is that? I mean, because whenever I talk to the MSC, they would say we're incredibly open, and anyone can come in and complain, and if the complaints aren't dealt with properly, then there's an independent scrutiny of it, and we couldn't be more open and transparent.
Couldn't be more open. Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between transparency and traceability that folks are talking about within the seafood supply chain, and what you're asking about really is the MSC as an eco label and a certification process themselves. And again, we have done the analysis, and they do offer more ways of interacting during the certification process than other labels do, for sure. More interaction opportunities for stakeholders. However, I think the frustration for a lot of stakeholders come in as the MSC has grown. It is very complex. In order to understand how to participate in a fishery certification or an audit, it's like you have to learn this whole language of legalese and what a principal indicator is and blah, 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 all of this stuff. And so we get folks getting in touch with us from all over the world, different organizations, species specialists, because we've participated in dozens and dozens and dozens of these things. And they say, I have this knowledge about this fishery or about the data research I'm doing on this whale, or how do I get it into the process? So the frustration about the kind of complexity and opaqueness of this institution they've created is very difficult. And I think they're missing out on a lot of local knowledge that's there, people who are working every day on the water, people who are working in the fisheries, who just want to get their information to them to say, I know about this fishery, please listen to me. And they're often dismissed because they didn't write it in the right paragraph or form for the certifying companies that are actually the third party using the MSC standard, right? So there's that aspect of it. And for those folks who, ourselves and others, people who are watching probably, who have participated in these every 5-year reviews of the standard, this chance where you can tweak it, make it a little bit better. We put an enormous amount of time into this work as NGOs often. It's hours and hours of staff time. And what we talked to them early on, three years ago almost, when they launched this next standard, was we put a paper towards them and we said, please, put your criteria out about how the board's going to make the decision in the end. Please put your rationale out. Let us observe at that board meeting even. Now, we've been denied the request to observe in their decision making because of that. It's just like governments. They're in the middle. Not everyone is going to be happy with the decisions they end up making about the standard and the tweaks to it. But at least if we can understand what is the rationale, what is the criteria, because what has happened in the past is people spend 1.5 years putting in time and effort and consulting and going to the workshops, and it all seems to be going forward. And then it goes into the last 3 months, which is what we are approaching right now. It goes into the boardroom, and out comes the last decisions, and they are often completely different than the consultation papers we've seen or the workshops we've all been attending. And there's this big black hole in the middle. And so for the hundreds, literally hundreds of experts and stakeholders and conservation groups who are helping them along with this standard, it is very frustrating because you just want to understand how they went from B 6 months ago over here to C. And so we've really encouraged, this time.
Take your point. Very, very interesting and well-made point. Right. Okay. Time is moving on. So I'm just want to touch on two more issues and then look at some questions here. One is the issue of sharks and the issue of fins being naturally attached. That is shark to try and frustrate shark finning in particular, and to keep a bit more accurate record of what sharks are being caught. Fins and the shark body should be kept attached, as now the case in many jurisdictions, but it's not universally supported by the MSC, although the MSC would say it hates the idea of shark finning, and the fisheries where shark fins are not kept attached are very special circumstances. I think it would argue, and the other is on labour standards. Human rights issues, potential slavery on board fishing ships. Although one would tend to assume that if someone has gone through all the trouble of getting MSC certification and jumped through all the hoops, they're probably amongst the good guys rather than the exploiters, by and large. MSC, of course, would argue that it sets environmental standards rather than labour standards. But I take it I'll come to you, Jakob. But I take it the people writing to you are concerned about labour standards too when they're buying fish. when they see films like Seaspiracy and they hear of slavery at sea and such like.
Well, there are obviously different issues, but then for the shark fins and the labour issues, I can give you the exact same answer as I did before with the dolphin being bycatch. So it's, consumers say, like, hey, can you absolutely guarantee me that this does not happen, in the value chain of the product we buy? And my answer is, and they say, well, can you at least guarantee it for the labeled products? Like, yeah, sorry, not that either. So again, we're at this point where, it becomes really hard as a retailer saying that defending the added value of a label. And I'm not saying that there is no added value at all, but these are really very, very important issues which are addressed, marginally at best.
Bubba, better turn to you, because when it comes to the shark finning issue, I think one of the fisheries that doesn't follow the fins naturally attached rule is New Zealand, is it not?
Yeah, and actually, I if you don't mind, I would like to address the human rights issue. the MSC ignores the human rights issue at its peril, and I think they've come to understand that they can't, they don't have that choice, and that's reflected in their actions more recently to withdraw a certificate for a company that was in which an observer was killed last year in Kiribati, as well as the most recent withdrawal of a certificate from the Hangtan company in Fiji immediately upon the discovery of some labor violations. So, they're not going to have a choice to address that issue. And
clearly, to be fair to them, clearly where there is evidence, they are acting.
I'm sorry.
When they are evidence, they would seem to be acting and striking off certification, although perhaps you would argue they're not being sufficiently proactive.
Yeah, and that's a matter of their own company sustainability and reputation. I mean, they're going to have to be proactive about it. They can't continue to play whack-a-mole because, as Steve well knows, these issues are going to pop up more and more frequently. There's getting more and more exposure over these issues, so they're not going to have a choice but to address it. The shark finning issue, despite the best efforts of a number of NGOs to try and push, a fins naturally attached policy, there are companies and countries around the world that refuse to abide by that regulation, and insist that they are able to, effectively separate the fins from the carcasses and deliver them to port, with full accountability. In the case of New Zealand, that's the argument that they make. The shark species that they catch in New Zealand's waters, they say that we deliver them from New Zealand's waters into New Zealand's ports, and everything is fully accounted. And that well may be the case for New Zealand, but it allows all those other countries who don't engage in the same level of oversight and scrutiny of landed fish to make the same argument at the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission level. And and that's unfortunate because it creates a huge gap in accountability of those fisheries and the sharks that they bring to shore.
Brad, on the issue of human rights in particular, is this an issue which the retailers and things raise with you?
Yeah, absolutely, and more so. To the points made earlier, I think it's a clear challenge for MSC, and they are going to have to address it somehow, either directly by building the capacity and the standard and the processes internally themselves, because it does require a whole different set of standards and tools for improvement, and that takes a lot of money and time and investment. On the other hand, there are organizations much like Steve's who have been working on these issues for many years and have a lot of that expertise, and so there could be a partnership or a joint venture type of arrangement that MSC makes with another organization to sort of take care of that piece of the equation. But either way, I think it's going to be increasingly important that they do something.
Thank you. Steve, do you want a quick word?
Yeah, just to echo what others on the panel have said, which is ignore it at your peril. There is increasing concern, I think, across the consuming market and among the major players in the retail market looking at human rights abuses in the seafood sector. And the key fact is now we all know that there is extensive system of abuse in many fisheries around the world. So the need is to address it. And we would just hope that the MSC can get to that point, incorporate it in their standard setting, and make sure that we can try and squeeze those problems out.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the last section of our discussion now. And I'm looking at some of the questions that have been typed in. One from Bilo Heinz Peter Studer about fish welfare. Fish welfare, not an issue that's been raised. And I've never seen any certification about it, whether it applies to aquaculture or to wild fishing. Does anyone have any comments on is there anything, are there any sort of standards that could be applied on fish welfare and the cruelty of fishing?
I mean, I'll jump in here. There is a standard in Australia for aquaculture that's looking at fish welfare, which is quite interesting and relatively new, that we've been assessing to see what they're taking into account. But I think this is a really good question in terms of the framing of this panel, which is, I can't remember exactly the title, but Ocean Vision 2030. And what is the role of eco-certifications looking forward, right? We're in a year starting off the decade of the UN Ocean of Science, and people are making these big aspirational goals at the world level to end overfishing, all these things. And I think it's a reflection of growing expectations out there in the world about how our industries act. So whether it's human rights with fishing, whether it's animal welfare issues, these are going to be more and more part of the conversation going forward. And so for eco certifications as a whole, what role do they play, right? Can they do everything for us to change these? I don't think so personally. I think they're one of our tools. And it's really important for those tools and what they're pushing for in terms of these things that are on the horizon, which people are now realizing, like ecosystem connected impacts, human rights abuses, like the animal welfare issue, etc. They need to be proactively looking at it, right? So that they're pushing the regulatory bodies, which ultimately are going to make the biggest impacts in some of these rule changes. They need to be there so that they're pushing that to happen faster. And so that's where I kind of sound like a bit of a broken record, but I come back to the fact that what is the role of these labels and market tools that we have? It is merely to help us move the whole game forward, right? And so they're not going to be able to address all these issues on their own, but they certainly shouldn't be undermining them or saying, that's good enough, status quo is good enough. And I think that's the issue that we're having, is that it's like status quo is fine. We're not aspirational as much as we should be. And you have to remember that these standards are a delay, right? The standard review and the process that's coming into place with MSC right now, it's not going to be applied to all the fisheries under its certification for another 8 years by the time it all comes into place. So what we're talking about now in our expectations for animal welfare, for human rights, for bycatch issues, we've got to be ahead of the ball right now, so that when all the fisheries catch up and get reassessed, that we're going to be at 2028 and what we expect by then. So it's, with the fins naturally attached that you brought up, we've been talking to MSC about it. They have been consulting on it for 10 years. And their most recent report finally said it is the global best practice according to the number of regulations that are now in place. And still, they are maybe not going to include it as a basic minimum requirement for policy. And I think it's important to remember that certifications, it's a fishery paying for someone to assess them so that they can have a better price at the market, or they can have market access. If you don't agree with that standard and you're like, I don't think fins naturally attached is something I really feel I need to do, you don't have to get the certification, right? It's like an extra reward in the marketplace. We shouldn't be trying to make the certification fit every single fishery and every single species that we possibly can, right? It is a privilege. It's something you pay for to get a better price, right? So we shouldn't equal it with regulatory bodies,
There's a question here. Thanks, Shannon. There's a question here from Amy Hammond saying, would the panel support a full external review of MSC to address these things? I'll come to you, Brad, but surely, the whole point is that MSC is not a governmental body. It's basically selling its product. It's selling its certification as a means of promoting sustainability. It's if it can't satisfy consumers that it is sustainable, it's not going to market.
Yeah, I guess the devil is in the details there in terms of what a full external review would look like. It's hard to think exactly what that would be, just given that MSC is ICL compliant in terms of their processes that they use for gathering input from stakeholders and the different advisory bodies that they hold. There are the challenges we talked about in terms of transparency, but they do put a lot of material out there to basically allow anyone to do the sort of assessments that each of us on the panel have done in our organizations. So we need to hear, I guess, more specifically what differently could be done.
Steve, you've been exceptionally critical of MSC during the course of the the last hour or so. Would you support the idea of an external review? Is it appropriate, or
Well, I think
are you trying to influence the existing, the internal processes?
well, short answer is yes, but as Brad says, the devil is in the detail. I think there is call for much greater engagement between the MSC and its critics, because most of its critics are its friends. And I make that point again and again. We want the MSC to succeed. That's the irony of this whole situation we're in. And I think having that external review so you can provide high caliber, quality, considered, objective advice can only be a plus. Nobody's looking at trying to harm or hurt the MSC for some spurious set of reasons. We're here to try and help it work and do its job better. So shorthand, yes, but you really do have to think about what that review would look like in the real world.
Well, I suppose if I was working for the MSC, Steve, and putting in all the hours trying to promote sustainability and the like, I'd feel, well, you call yourselves friends, but and you really are not trying to undermine the MSC, but following on from Seaspiracy and the like, with constant criticisms of MSC publicly expressed, are bound to undermine its work. That's the argument they many of its staff must put to you.
I think you could say it's damned by its success, even though it still only accounts for a relatively small proportion of global marine seafood capture. But the point here is not about my sensitivities and vulnerabilities or somebody in the MSC and how they feel about things. It's about trying to achieve a meaningful goal, which is the sustainability of marine seafood capture. That's what we need to do, and that is their job. And there's a point that I would make at this stage. I have a growing anxiety that the MSC is now focusing on the institutional imperatives of the MSC and not its cause or mission related ones, which is to bring sustainability to seafood. I think it's worrying as much about its market share, about its reputation, dare I say about its brand, because that's all it is, rather than the end game. And what we want to do is take this debate away from this kind of panel, and they're not even here to answer, which is a huge shame. They're not even here to contribute and answer and have a constructive debate. And to put it in a place where we could say, how do we make this better together? Not asking for the sun and the moon for unrealistic ends. How do we make this better over a given period of time so that the MSC can become that gold standard and can achieve its own stated goal?
Bubba, you're with us still, I hope. The MSC only certifies 14% of the world's catch. 86%, thereabouts, certainly 80% of the world's catch is not being certified as sustainable. I mean, for all your frustrations, surely the real target should be the 80%. The people who are not fishing sustainably, the people who are overfishing, the people who don't give a damn about any of the things we've discussed today.
Well, I think a couple of the other panelists mentioned it. At the end of the day, the MSC certification is a commercial choice by those fisheries that ultimately decide to get certified. And and maybe that's one of its limitations, but it's also allowed for those those fisheries that are most willing to take on efforts towards sustainability to pursue that goal. Now, I don't suggest that in this case that this limitation doesn't have an impact, because even if it's only 15%. That does obviously drive the activity of others. And I think a good example of that is we would not be discussing the implementation of basic harvest strategies and harvest control rules in the Western and Central Pacific, but for the MSC certification. And, there's been other issues that have arisen that, even the shark finning issue was driven in large part by the discussion within the MSC and the potential for losing markets as a result of that issue. So, for whatever faults that exist with the MSC, it has in the past been a significant driver on certain issues and continues to be a driver on other issues. I think, as Steve mentions, we want to see it, rise to the level that it needs to be to ensure sustainability, and we want to push it in that direction. And as both Brad and Steve have mentioned, the devil is in the details as to how we get there. But as a commercial choice, not all fisheries are going to pursue MSC, and that's why it's so important for them to drive the regulatory decisions that are made to bring those other fisheries into the fold, regardless of whether they make that commercial choice to achieve certification.
Brad, I said that MSC certifies about 14%, depending on fisheries improvement programs, of the global catch. I mean, what's the limit to certification? I mean, especially with all these extra requirements, the cost of certification is not cheap now. It will increase and become more complex if some of these reforms are carried out. At what point do you have to actually say, well, certification has reached its voluntary limit now? Real progress depends on governments across the world taking action to control the fishing industry.
Yeah, I think to carry on to Bubba's point, that is a key to unlocking more percentage of the global production to be even eligible to participate in the MSC program. I think in its current construct, there are significant limitations to growth in terms of coverage. One of those big gaps that hasn't been brought into the program yet is production caught by small-scale fisheries in mostly developing countries. The requirements that are set up, that were built into the MSC, were set up largely for more industrial fisheries in developed countries that have relatively strong governance and the resources to deliver on fisheries management as traditionally known. So whether MSC adapts its standard or sort of conducts a separate parallel standard that's designed for small-scale fisheries in developing countries, or again some other group sort of steps in to fill that gap, I think it's going to come at some point in order to give those sort of assurances that improvements are being made on that other 80% that you mentioned, Chris.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone have a last comment, because we have got to wind up in a couple of minutes' time?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that there. I think that, for the 14% that are certified, the devil is in the details in terms of on the water. Are the practices changing on the water enough for those fisheries? And then for the other things, I think that's part of the reason why we are more public. Many of us have spent a decade or more engaging internally with the MSC. Many meetings, many submissions and all of that. And I think that what is happening now is MSC is seen in discussions in ocean policy as holding a standard that demonstrates what fisheries management should look like. They're on the SDG, they're on the SDG discussions, they're on the UN high-level panel for oceans. They are partnering with developing countries in particular to say, this is where you should be looking to as you develop your institutions around what management needs to be and that kind of thing. And so beyond like certified fisheries, if the MSC standard is being held up as this is what you should aim for as you're developing new management practices, and this is what you should be looking to, and it was built, as Brad said, on a very heavy institution, European type of management practice, that's where it's all the more important for us to engage with MSC and what that standard is saying should be management, because that is then getting to the rest of the 80% that isn't certified. They are now engaging in policy advocacy and work, and they would say they're not an advocacy group, but by working with those countries and holding up their standard as what everyone should design their management towards, that becomes very worrisome for me. If that standard is not really putting out there simple, good, strong management levels to begin with, right? When you're developing all new institutions. So it is actually broader than just those like 14% that you're looking at in the store and picking up for those of us involved in fisheries management and policy circles.
What a fascinating discussion. Jakob, you want to come in with a word?
Yes, I would like to add on what Brad said about small-scale fisheries. It's often not viable for small-scale fisheries, as the MSC standard was designed a lot about large-scale industrial European fisheries. And I think this is a very important point, because if we look at what kind of catch was certified by the MSC, then we see that in the beginning there was, a part of small-scale fisheries, a part of large-scale industrial fisheries. However, if you look at it now, 83% of its catch is large-scale industrial fisheries, mostly purse seiners and trawlers, which is not most people would associate with sustainable fishing. However, if you look at the commercials of MSC, we see, I think it's around 50% of the images is, small scale fishers laughing happily from their boats holding a tuna or something. So obviously this is what consumers think what consumers want, because otherwise it wouldn't be much of a point in putting that in your commercials. And well, as long as there's such a discrepancy in what is actually certified versus what is, what's in the commercials, then there's a huge issue. So I think that having access or being accessible for smaller scale fisheries is actually one of the more important things that the MSC could and should do.
That's an interesting comment. Of course, reflection is that whenever people want to talk about, governments want to talk about fishing, they tend to look at the small scale and things that people can relate to. And then you look at the video produced by Environmental Justice Foundation at the beginning, and you get a sense of the much bigger scale and the realities of the fishing industry, which is very different in practice. I said that I think that's been a fascinating discussion, and if I was on the receiving end, that is the Marine Stewardship Council, I would recognise you, I think, as friends, albeit critical friends. So I want to thank my panelists. That's Shannon Arnold of Sea Choice, the Ecology Action Centre, also in Canada. Bubba Cook, WWF's Pacific Tuna Programme Manager, based in New Zealand. Jakob Surber, the Sustainability Specialist for Migros, the Swiss retailer. Steve Trent, the Chief Executive of the Environmental Justice Foundation. And Brad Spear, the Director of the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, based in the USA. Now, each of you want to bring about change to ensure the survival and rebuilding of fish stocks and the protection of the marine environment. As critical friends, you recognise, I think, that is the object too of the Marine Stewardship Council. So let's just hope that today's discussion will have helped promote understanding and move the agenda forward. All the very best to you, and thank you for taking part.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks.